They found him, alive, inside a buried shipping container, hidden in a field just 6 miles from home. 12 years after he vanished. No cameras, no witnesses, no screams heard. Just a barren field, cracked dry earth, and a pickup truck parked quietly by the riverbank. Headlights still on, engine still warm. Sergeant Jalen Morris disappeared on a summer afternoon on his way to a veterans reunion at his old Army base. Police said he left on his own. Friends went silent. The case went cold. But in year 12, as drought peeled back layers of ancient mud, the truth surfaced. A container, expertly, buried in the middle of a field with no trace above ground. When the lid was pried open, what lay inside wasn't a body. It was Jalen, alive, chained, eyes still open. And for 12 years, no one had listened to his sister. The only one who kept insisting he didn't disappear. He was hidden. Jalen Morris was born and raised in Mayfield, a small southern town where time seemed to move slow and silence was often the solution to anything uncomfortable. He was the oldest son in a family of 3. After their father died in a suspicious work accident that no one ever investigated, Jalen became the only pillar holding up his mother and younger sister. Though he'd been a disciplined, by-the-book soldier who was never late, Jalen was incredibly gentle at home, patching neighbors' roofs, changing light bulbs for the blind, elderly woman down the street, and running free football clinics for kids every Saturday afternoon. He rarely spoke about his time in the military, but sometimes, on sleepless nights, he'd sit on the porch, stare into the pitch-black sky, and sigh. Some things don't make it into the report. People viewed Jalen in different ways. To the black community, he was a role model. But to some of the town's older white residents, folks who remembered how things used to be, he was someone who knew too much. A month before he disappeared, Jalen started acting differently, taking solo trips, collecting documents, writing in secret, and occasionally borrowing old medical records from the local hospital. Kiara, his younger sister, remembers that day vividly. When she asked what he was working on, he simply said, "If anything happens to me, remember this. Don't trust the paperwork. Trust what you already know about me." A week later, he was gone. The morning of August 17th, 1995 started like any other. Jalen woke up at 6 a.m., had his usual black coffee, and made breakfast by hand for his mother and sister. He wore a simple khaki shirt, tucked his notebook into the inside pocket, and told his mom he'd be back before sunset. That day, he said, was a veterans gathering at an old Army camp near the county border, a place that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. Kiara thought it was odd. Why hold a reunion somewhere so remote with no power, no facilities? But she didn't ask. She trusted him. Jalen always had a reason for everything he did. From 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. that day, no one could reach him. The landline at home stayed silent. Kiara began to worry when one of Jalen's friends, Terrence, also a veteran, knocked on their door around 5 p.m. asking, "Did Jalen say anything about canceling?" I showed up and nobody was there. Jalen's dark green pickup truck was found at 7 p.m., parked by a narrow riverbank nearly 3 miles from the old Army site. The door was slightly ajar. Keys still in the ignition. Headlights on. The left blinker was still flashing. Inside the truck, his wallet was untouched. No signs of struggle. No blood. Nothing missing, except for his notebook. Local police were called, but didn't treat the situation as urgent. They labeled it an adult voluntarily leaving. One young officer bluntly said, "Guys like him, PTSD gets to them. Maybe he just needed to get away." Within 48 hours, the case was closed as non-critical missing. But to Kiara, it made no sense. Her brother wasn't someone who ran. He loved his family, had clear plans, and was taking care of their sick mother. There was no reason for him to vanish, unless someone made sure he did. That first night without him, Kiara didn't sleep. She went to the riverbank and stood beside the truck, imagining him behind the wheel. An owl called out from the woods, startling her. The sky was pitch black, no moon. And in that moment, deep in her gut, she knew something was very, very wrong here. On the 3rd day after Jalen disappeared, Kiara started knocking on doors with his photo. She walked through the heat from the grocery store to the gas station, from the barbershop to the church. No one had seen anything. No engines heard. No voices across the fields. A few people looked away. Others repeated the same line. Maybe he just needed space. The local newspaper ran a short piece on page 5. Local veteran reported missing. Underneath was an outdated photo of Jalen, not even recent, and the wrong age listed. Sheriff Harold Crane gave a statement. "We've found no evidence of foul play. He may have chosen to be somewhere else." But Kiara didn't believe that. She began creating a paper map on her bedroom wall. marking every detail. Where he left, where the truck was found, the wind direction that day, every scrap of information she could gather. She wrote to state officials, emailed veterans, organizations, even faxed a journalist known for covering forgotten war victims. No one responded. 2 weeks later, a 10-year-old boy in town found an old military boot along a dirt path leading out to the field behind the army camp. His mother called Kiara, only because she remembered her son once playing football with Jalen. Kiara rushed over. The boot was worn, but the sole still had 3 letters, carved into it, JM3, the way Jalen marked all his gear in the service. She knelt down, hands trembling as she picked it up. It was his. The boot was found 9 miles from the original site, a place it couldn't have ended up naturally. No road, no traffic. Police said it was likely a prank. They refused to test it for evidence. But Kiara knew this was a message, a cry for help. The first, maybe the only, trace he left behind. She started visiting that field every weekend, at first just to watch. Then she began digging, one patch of soft earth at a time, alone, in the heat, no help. Neighbors watched her with a mix of pity and doubt. She's taking this too far, they whispered. But Kiara didn't care. To her, every inch of that ground might be hiding a truth no one else dared to face. Nearly 3 months passed since Jalen's disappearance. The town had gone quiet. No more news stories. In police records, Jalen Morris's name sank to the bottom of a long list of non-urgent disappearances. But for Kiara, those days were far from quiet. She had started uncovering clues no one else wanted to see. One late night, she found a folded hand-drawn map tucked beneath the rug in Jalen's room. On it was the field behind the army camp, marked in red ink with a strange symbol. 3 overlapping circles, like a drainage or bunker system. Next to it, a rushed note read, "Matches missing cases," from 7481. At the town library, she dug through old archives and found at least 2 missing veterans. Black men who'd lived in Mayfield, whose cases were never seriously investigated. One was labeled as ran off with a lover. The other, depressed, left voluntarily. Both had disappeared in the same area, near that field, during years when rumors swirled about the old army base being used for new physiological testing. Following leads from Jalen's past, Kiara reached out to Terrence, the only veteran friend, still willing to speak. He remembered the day of the reunion clearly. "I got there 30 minutes late. No one was around. No cars, no name tags, no chairs. Just an old empty base. Creepy as hell." A week later, Terrence left town. No goodbyes. His phone stopped working. No one knew where he went. Kiara started keeping a detailed investigation journal, documenting everything she uncovered. She shared pieces of it on an anonymous veterans forum. One person replied, claiming to have worked plumbing at the old base in 1992 and mentioned hearing about a neural isolation project. When she asked to meet, the user vanished from the forum. Each clue felt like a faint glimmer, but together, they formed a picture. Jalen may not have been the first, and maybe he'd discovered something others didn't want. Exposed, on the exact 1-year anniversary of Jalen's disappearance, Kiara returned to the field. The air smelled of scorched grass. Storm clouds gathered overhead. She sat down, eyes locked on the spot with the circle, symbol from the map. No one believed her, but she believed. Believed that, buried under this earth, was something no one had ever dared to name. In the 2nd year after Jalen disappeared, Kiara decided to do what the police had refused from the beginning. Retrace the steps, speak to every person who saw Jalen during his final week, ask the same questions again, and compare the answers. What she found didn't surprise anyone, except herself. The first was Mr. Carter, the mechanic who'd once serviced Jalen's truck. He claimed he'd seen Jalen the morning before he vanished, said he looked tired, and mentioned wanting to get away for a few days. But the shop's records showed Jalen's last visit had been 5 days earlier, and Mr. Carter couldn't explain the discrepancy. Another neighbor, Mrs. Tilda, said she saw Jalen leave that morning, wearing a military uniform driving east. But Jalen no longer owned any uniforms. He'd returned them all after discharge, and he wasn't headed east. The veterans meeting, according to him, was west. Police had taken these statements without ever verifying them. When Kiara brought this to their attention, she was told, "People misremember things all the time." But to her, this wasn't confusion. It felt like deliberate noise. She started asking herself, why were so many people getting it wrong? Were their memories truly faulty? Or were they repeating a script, something agreed upon? The inconsistencies weren't in the small details, but in a strange consensus among people who barely knew each other. She had no hard proof, but she had a feeling. A feeling that Jalen had become taboo in this town, and anyone who broke that silence might pay a price. One autumn day in 1998, Kiara returned to the old army base. She went alone, carrying a flashlight, her maps, and satellite images she'd convinced a friend in the military to get through civilian services. That's when she found something no one had ever mentioned. At the southwest corner of the field, near the edge of the forest, there was an old dirt path, mostly buried, but not completely gone. She followed the trail past a broken fence to a shallow circular dip in the ground about 3 meters across. The grass in the center was yellowed, like something heavy had sat there for a long time. She took photos, measured everything. Years later, in 2007, the container would be found in that exact spot. But back then, no one believed her. Even the military friend who had helped with the maps began avoiding her calls. On a veterans forum, an anonymous user responded to one of her posts, "Let the past sleep. If you keep digging, it'll wake up, and it's not friendly." She saved the comment but didn't reply. To her, silence was more terrifying than any threat. While digging through land records at City Hall, Kiara stumbled upon a 1992 permit for drainage repairs, filed by a private contractor for the abandoned army base. The request was signed by the mayor at the time. The listed project: foundation reinforcement and sub-basement ventilation. But the building had been empty since 1985. No one could explain the work. When she asked to copy the original file, a records clerk told her that document's been pulled by administrative order. She only had time to read the final 3 lines. Steel framework installation, complete. Soundproofing ensured, do not list on official site plans. In early 2001, Kiara received a package with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, written in blue ink. Find John Amos, maintenance crew at the base in 95. Lives near old rail line, outskirts of Greene County. No further instructions. No explanation. It took nearly 3 weeks of chasing scraps of information before she found him. An elderly man, living in a weathered cabin tucked deep in the pine woods. When she arrived, he was sitting on the porch. His face was lined, his eyes cloudy but sharp. "You're Morris's sister, aren't you?" he asked, before she even introduced herself. Kiara nodded, steadying her voice. "I need to know if you ever worked there. Did you see anything? Or hear anything?" Mr. Amos was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled an old lighter from his pocket, flicked it on, then off, 3 times. Like a reflex. Finally, he said, "I didn't see anything, but I heard. I was the maintenance guy for the old vent systems at the camp. Every week, I checked the airflow in the sub-basement at the back. Nobody went down there. That section had been sealed off. One time, while inspecting the lower level, he heard tapping, faint, rhythmic, like metal hitting a wall. At first, he thought it was an animal trapped. But when he got closer, it stopped. Then 2 distinct knocks, slow and deliberate. Not a rat, not machinery. Someone. He reported it to his supervisor. 2 days later, he was reassigned to the supply shed and never allowed near the sub-basement again. I didn't say anything to anyone, but when your brother disappeared, I knew. I'd probably heard the last sound he ever managed to send out." Mr. Amos looked at her. "I'm no brave man, but you are. If you made it here, I owe you the truth." Before she left, he handed her a hand-drawn diagram, a map of the old ventilation system he used to maintain. One of the ducts ran directly beneath the field behind the army base, the same field where Jalen would be, found 6 years later. He circled a section in red and wrote 3 words, "Silent but alive." His story didn't come with evidence. No one could confirm it. But it did what no official file ever had. It reopened the question at the heart of everything. Maybe Jalen wasn't killed. Maybe he was hidden. The summer of 2007 was so dry that even the oldest residents in town said they'd never seen anything like it. The earth cracked in wide patches, trees turned brittle and brown, and the Tallapoosa River shrank down to a muddy ditch. The Weather Service called it the drought of the century. For the people of Mayfield, it was a season of wildfires, crop failure, and the stench of rotting garbage rising from the swamps. But for Kiara, it was a sign. She returned to the field behind the old army base, the place she'd marked on her map, the one with the circular symbol her brother had once drawn. The ground there, once soft and damp, was now split and dry, revealing twisted roots like veins under pressure. A group of out-of-state college students conducting a soil study on post-drought biological changes happened to drag geophysical equipment across the field. Then, a strange sound. Hollow metal. Something was buried underneath. They thought it was an old water tank, but no records mentioned any infrastructure in that area. After getting casual approval from local authorities, who waved it off as probably an old utility site. The students began a small dig. When the first layer of soil was cleared, what emerged wasn't a water tank. It was a rusted circle, caked in dried mud, with a bent ventilation pipe sticking out. The steel hatch was heavy. They used crowbars to pry it open. A rush of foul air hit them immediately. A mix of stagnant water, rust, decay, and something faintly like dried blood. They shined a light into the pit below. At first, they saw only metal walls. Then a movement, a shadow, an arm, a breath, a pair of open eyes. Panic set in fast. One student vomited on the spot. Another screamed for emergency services. When medics arrived, they wore full protective suits, unsure what they were dealing with. But as they lifted the figure out, slowly, carefully, they realized this wasn't a body. This was a man, alive, emaciated, hair pure white, lips cracked, his right arm chained to a metal ring bolted to the container floor. His eyes, nearly blind to daylight, still searched the room. He couldn't speak, but he was conscious. No one could believe what they were witnessing. He was rushed to a temporary trauma facility outside the county, one that specialized in long-term isolation. Victims. Doctors said he was in extreme physiological collapse, dehydrated, muscle atrophy, near total speech loss. His body showed signs of having survived at the edge, more instinct than awareness. Oddly, his older injuries had healed. His hair had grown long and white. His fingernails were splintered vertically, a classic sign of repeated scraping against hard surfaces. As medical photos began circulating internally, Kiara got her first phone call from officials in 12 years. She arrived at the hospital carrying a feeling she couldn't name, somewhere between hope and fear, belief and dread. She stepped into the room. There he lay, silent, still. But when she said, "Jalen, it's me, it's Kiara," his eyes fluttered, then opened fully. No one spoke, but they both knew. No DNA test, no ID card needed, just that look. The look of two siblings who had grown up together, mourned their father together, and survived winters without heat. 1 week later, DNA results confirmed the unthinkable. The man found in the container was Jalen Morris, missing since 1995, and still alive. Shockwaves spread. Town police stayed silent. State officials launched a preliminary investigation. News outlets picked up the story, but most coverage was brief, avoiding words like imprisonment or abduction. Instead, they called it an unexplained situation and referred to Jalen as a memory loss victim. But Jalen hadn't completely lost his memory. As his body began to recover and after weeks of physical therapy, he started to speak. One word at a time. His voice was hoarse, fragmented, like a broken tape. But his words were clear. Container, light, wind, water, pumped through pipe. Doctors concluded he had been regularly supplied for the first few years. Through a vent pipe, some kind of nutrient solution. Not enough for health, but enough for survival. Then, one day, the supply stopped. No one knows why, but Jalen survived. Off rainwater that leaked through the hatch. Off rats, snakes, and small reptiles that fell down the pipe. He used a broken metal shard to mark the wall, a line for every day that passed. Total lines, 4,000. Each mark a declaration that he hadn't died, that he hadn't disappeared, that he had waited to be found. When doctors confirmed Jalen was stable enough to provide testimony, an independent investigation unit was assembled from a neighboring state. Leading the effort was Inspector Gabrielle Hines, a black woman known for her work on cases involving systemic abuse. She was the first official to refer to Jalen not as a psychologically unstable victim, but as a survivor of a systematic, inhumane isolation. Their first interview took place in a closed room, with Kiara and a volunteer attorney present. Jalen, still thin and frail, sat upright in the chair. His eyes, once clouded, now held clarity. He spoke slowly, in fragmented pieces, as if dredging memory from a deep, dark place. He remembered the night, after leaving the old army camp where only 2 men were present, neither of whom he recognized. His vehicle was blocked. One of them said in a cold voice, "You've seen too much. That wasn't meant for you." Then a flash of light, a sharp chemical smell, hinges creaking, darkness. They didn't torture him, didn't beat him. They just left him alive, inside a steel chamber, chained to the floor with a vent pipe and a feeding tube. Each week, someone above poured down a thick, tasteless liquid. Not food, not poison. Just enough to keep him aware. Enough for him to understand he was being kept. No one ever appeared face to face. Only footsteps, the clang of a hatch, the sound of liquid sliding through the pipe, then silence. Each day he scratched a line into the wall. Not to track time, but to remind himself, if I can, still count. I'm still alive. What shocked Kiara wasn't Jalen's story. It was the government's response. Despite his testimony, state officials didn't expand the investigation. No one summoned the men stationed at the base in 1995. They claimed no sufficient evidence to identify the parties involved. The case was sealed for public safety. And just like that, those who had once doubted, Jalen went quiet again. A wall went back up. This time, it wasn't made of skepticism. It was made of fear. After the interrogation, Kiara resumed her search for old clues. She tried reaching out to John Amos, the man who once heard tapping beneath the base. But his house was empty. Neighbors said his family took him somewhere else. No forwarding address. She returned to City Hall to request copies of the 1992 construction files, only to be told they were lost during digitization. All documentation related to the base's structural work had vanished. Even her old military contact, the one who'd sent her satellite maps, cut ties, emails bounced, phone disconnected. Lid by lead, everything began to fade. Everyone who once helped her had disappeared. No one wanted to talk about Jalen. No one wanted to face the truth. If someone could be locked away for 12 years and no one knew, what did that say about the system? In the end, it was Jalen who asked the biggest question. During a rare private interview, recorded off camera, with no media present, someone asked, "Who do you think did this to you?" He looked straight into the lens. His voice was dry, gravelly. Not a person, not a group, a habit of erasing anyone who makes them uncomfortable. The interviewer froze. Not because it was accusatory, but because it was true. He wasn't talking about a conspiracy. He was talking about a system, a machine that doesn't need orders to run, just silence long enough. For Jalen, surviving wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life no one prepares you for. A life after confinement, after being forgotten, where every person he met, instead of saying, "How miraculous," whispered, "I wish he hadn't come back." Jalen Morris didn't stay in Mayfield. After regaining some of his strength, he and Kiara moved to another state, somewhere no one knew their names, where the headlines had long forgotten the story that once shook a summer to its core. He lived quietly in a small house near the woods. Most evenings he sat on the porch, his gaze distant, as if still seeing through that thick wall of steel. He didn't speak much, but sometimes when the late sunlight slanted across the wooden table, he'd take a small knife and carve into the trunk of a tree, not to count days, but to remind his hands what it felt like to still be here. One day, Kiara returned to the field where he'd once been held. All that remained was a patch of bare earth. The swampy ground had been leveled. The steel container, once an unspoken prison, had been hauled away and scrapped. But before it was removed, Jalen had etched a final message into its wall using the same metal shard that helped him survive. "I didn't disappear. I was held. No one was prosecuted." No formal apology was ever made. The records were sealed. Real names slowly vanished from public files. Some people said the past should be left alone. Others called it a bureaucratic mistake. But Jalen didn't want an apology. He just wanted to live, not as a symbol, but as a man who had been buried alive in silence and was finally dug out by the unwavering love of his sister. Some stories don't have endings. Some people are disappeared, not because they were wrong, but because they were right too soon. And sometimes truth doesn't come crashing down like thunder. It waits quietly. For drought, for someone who won't give up, or for you to listen instead of scroll past. Thank you for watching this video. If this story moved you, share it with someone. Because somewhere out there, someone might still be waiting to be remembered.